Contexto é o podcast para ampliar a discussão sobre a circulação de textos e discursos na sociedade, como também sobre as ideologias construídas por eles. Abordamos temas como linguagem, sociedade, educação e filosofia. O projeto é uma produção desenvolvida por estudantes e docentes do Núcleo de Estudos em Discurso e Sociedade do Programa Interdisciplinar de Pós-Graduação em Linguística Aplicada da UFRJ. Vem com a gente pensar texto em contexto. Bem-vindos a mais um episódio do Contexto. Hoje contamos com a incrível conversa produzida por Daniel Silva e Douglas Knupp com a incrível pesquisadora da Universidade de Exeter do Reino Unido, Birgul. Birgul discute o fenômeno da securitização e como ela está entrelaçada à racialização. Embora trate de um contexto específico, as perguntas que ela faz são pertinentes a muitas nações. Afinal, quem são as pessoas consideradas suspeitas, inimigas ou criminosas? Quais corpos e etnias representam perigo ou ameaça? Como elas resistem a inúmeros eixos de opressão? A reflexão encaminhada aponta muitas contradições do chamado Estado democrático. Agora, fiquem com essa incrível entrevista.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good evening to Birgul, who's 3 hours ahead of us in the future. Birgul, thank you so much for accepting this invitation to join our podcast. We're very happy to have you here. Daniel, thank you so much for agreeing to co-host this with me. I'm much more confident that I have a fine scholar like yourself together with me in this mission. I want to start, already on fire, and I want to ask Birgul a question, if you will don't mind. So, Birgul, so you were a Kurdish woman living in the United Kingdom, in England, right? Could you elaborate briefly on your identity as a Kurdish migrant? How does your trajectory get entangled with an aspect that you study in your doctoral thesis, which is learning your language, Kurdish, as an adult, especially considering that the whole Kurdish context is really not very familiar to us here in Brazil? And again, thank you very much for agreeing to be here with us.
So thank you, Douglas, and thank you, Danielle, for this lovely invitation. It's really nice to be sharing this space with you and having this conversation with you. So thank you a lot. Okay, so yes, I am a Kurdish woman from Turkey. As you probably know, Kurdistan is divided into 4 countries in the Middle East: Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. And there are still some Kurds living in Armenia as well. But we also have a very big diaspora in Europe and North America. So I moved to the UK 22 years ago. I came here to study. So I studied in London. And during my undergraduate studies, one of my professors was Professor Jenny Cheshire, who was teaching sociolinguistics. And one day she noticed that I had some, I had mentioned being Kurdish to her. And she suggested, why don't I write an essay on Kurdish? And then I just started, delving into, oh my God, yes, I am actually Kurdish. I don't speak Kurdish, but how do I write this essay on this topic? And that was around the time when I started thinking intellectually about being a Kurd. But before that, I grew up in an Anatolian village where I was not aware of my Kurdishness at all. I knew that my grandparents spoke a different language, but when I went to school, I automatically knew that I should have never mentioned that there is a different language in our family, and that's kind of like our secret. But before we started recording, as I mentioned, at some point, one of my classmates noticed that my accent was different, and she basically told me that I shouldn't pronounce things the way I was pronouncing them. And that actually silenced me for about a year until my father was called to school, like that I was not speaking out, because at that moment I noticed that something was wrong with my language, that I did not speak like the others. So I carried this all the way to the UK context. And so when I started writing this essay, I started meeting some Kurds in London. And then I became more aware of my Kurdish identity. But there was this whole essentialism around, if you're Kurdish, you need to speak Kurdish. And I didn't speak Kurdish. So I decided to, dedicate my PhD on this topic. So I was at King's College, like you were, Douglas, for a while. So I did my MA there, and I met Roxy Harris and Ben Rumpton there. And during my MA, I did my first field work. I went to this Kurdish community center, and I was interested in how diaspora Kurds were learning Kurdish as adults. So I basically combined their stories with mine, and then took it from there.
All right, very good, Birgul. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Douglas, for inviting me to co-host this conversation. So, Birgul, a Wikipedia entry on Kurds living in Turkey says, and I quote, following the military coup of 1980, the Kurdish languages were officially prohibited in public and private life. Many people who spoke, published, or sang in Kurdish were arrested and imprisoned. In Turkey, it is illegal to use Kurdish as a language of instruction in both public and private schools, end quote. So could you talk about Kurdish as a security issue in Turkey?
Mm-hmm. So yes, interestingly, I was born in 1980s, right when this military coup was happening, and that's probably why my parents chose not to speak to me in Kurdish, because for their generation, they could still speak among themselves, quite secretly, not publicly. Because Kurds live in very rural areas, my grandparents lived in a valley, like they could not be really spotted by the state. So they did not have a lot of contact with the city or with the state. So they could really enjoy, I think, speaking Kurdish within around the village. But my generation, we had to go to school, state-funded school. So I think my parents' generation became much more aware of hiding the Kurdish language and the identity, so that we could pass as Turks, because physically we cannot be differentiated. So if you don't also speak Kurdish, nobody would know that you're a Kurd. So before this military coup, there was another coup, I think, in the 1960s. So each time Kurdish language basically suffered a little bit more. And I think the 80s was the worst, because this is when also everything became clearer in the constitution. So basically, the first 3 articles of the Turkish constitution says any other language other than Turkish cannot be spoken. So basically, that is breaking the law immediately. And the second article says you cannot really break this law, and the third one re-emphasizes it more. So the constitution basically bans the language, and anybody speaking Kurdish publicly was persecuted. So imprisonments were quite common in the 80s and even quite lately. So you would every now and then hear, up until like very recently, somebody who was singing in Kurdish got arrested and got imprisoned. So when I started doing my fieldwork in 2011, lots of lawyers, mayors, and politicians were imprisoned, and they started language activism in prisons. They wanted, basically, they were learning Kurdish, but at the same time also asking for translators to make the Kurdish language much more visible. So it has, yes, always been a security issue in Turkey, because it basically is disloyalty to the state, but at the same time, it's seen as separatism and terrorism. So if you speak Kurdish, you're a Kurd, and every Kurd is a terrorist, unless, well, you are siding with the state explicitly. So it's always been a threat to national security, and at the same time to the nation state, because the real problems Kurds started having started with the nation state building process in the 19th century. That was like, when this language ideologies around one language, one nation started everywhere. So this also affected the Kurdish language, because Kurds don't have a state, so therefore they cannot also have a language. So the question of being stateless and still claiming a language and identity is super problematic within the nation state understanding of how people operate. So yes, until now, despite all EU regulations and democratizing Turkey, well, the country still has not been really successful in accepting, yes, there are these people and there is this language, and the language is still seen as it was initially identified as an unknown language, and then it was like, these are mountain Turks, but eventually this language is a threat to our security, and yeah, basically it's better you don't speak it.
That's fascinating. I mean, terribly, but still fascinating. So now your current research is on squats in Athens, right? Could you tell us about the research a little bit? Specifically, what can you say to us about the racial dynamics there that you found in this squat or squats? And how relevant do you think the concept of securitization is for your field work on those squats?
Yeah, thank you. So I started doing fieldwork in Greece in 2016, and that fieldwork was on Lesbos Island. So this was part of a large project with the Hellenic Open University, where we did team ethnography in refugee camps. And from this research project, I developed my own, which was my British Academy one. And that one gave me the opportunity to work in squats. So initially I was interested in the question of governmentality, because refugee camps are, governed by multiple actors, like the supranational actors, UNHCR, and then the local actors, and then all sorts of other EU member states, and it's a very, very complex way of governing. So this made me think about, okay, I think I really understand how this governmentality thing works with like different structures and different, practices, policies. But then I became quite interested in, what does it mean to be self-governed? Because I was still visiting Athens, and I started meeting these self-organized activists, and they were also mobilizing their resources to accommodate refugees in like hotels. So they would occupy hotels, occupy universities, and create alternative structures to state structures, like camps. So they would try to create spaces that are contrary to the state ones, like refugee camps. So they would rather go and occupy spaces and create a counter space within the city. So when I started, having interactions with these self-organized people, I noticed that they were at the same time struggling with communication, translation, because there were refugees from everywhere and also solidarians from all over the world. So there was definitely an issue around, what kind of language is going to be their shared language, and how do you actually also conceptualize language if you are self-organized. I mean, from this socio-political perspective, language is not like, because I think in sociolinguistics and applied linguistics, we dealt a lot with notions of, neoliberalism and all sorts of understandings of language from above, let's say. But in this sense, how do we really understand language from a self-organized and to an extent anarchist perspective, which was my challenge. I was like, these guys are not talking about the same thing. I mean, I know a lot about activists as well, activists revitalizing language, and we know from Danielle's work, issues around register. We know that these guys are trying to do something different. But so there was this huge question in front of me. So I went into one of these squads and started basically immersing myself, literally, because I was told that I could not be like this ethnographer who goes with a recorder and interviews people. They asked me, like, you really have to participate in this community. And obviously, initially, my whole idea was like, this is a utopia. This is a great world, because I'm sure here there's no racism, no, sexism, all of these things happening. But then, interestingly, you find out something about humans, that we have somehow always developed ways of being hierarchical, or being a little bit less favor of certain maybe groups and things like that. So on the surface, obviously everything looked great, but then I start seeing a lot of these contradictions and the racial issues. But I think for my interlocutors, this was a struggle that we could not really idealize, that this is actually how humans coexist. And they use this term coexistence. So we will always coexist with people who are different than us, and we probably always have some sort of relational issues. So they would frame it like, this is human struggle. This is not just specific to this place or that place, but at least we're aware of these contradictions. So yes, I would say whatever you see, anywhere, any institution or any group of people, I think somehow we do establish hierarchies and structures that are not always, in favor of certain people. Yeah.
Very, very interesting, Birgul, and I see a lot of resonance through, the self-organization of favelas. We could talk about this later, but let's follow the script here. So you and Douglas and I went to this conference in Ghent, the Sociolinguistic Symposium, in 2022, and we all participated in a panel on securitization, surveillance, and sociolinguistics. And there you presented a paper about your work in as Archaea and the squats there, and you framed this notion of self-securitization. So you added this self prefix to the notion of securitization, and I think that's embedded in your last comment. So could you elaborate on this notion of self-securitization, and how is it helpful to understand your data and the analysis you do of them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, this conference was quite some time ago, and I can't say I still figured out what I mean by self, but there was a question that if I meant self as like a neoliberal notion, and I think I mentioned it there that's not, I'm not really referring to the self as a technology. So I was just recently reading Milani and Levon's paper on securitization. This one on desire on Palestine and Israel. So in that paper, they do mention the self as a, as part of technology of self. But the self I have been working on is the one in relation to others. So it's referring to Foucault's notion of ethics of the care of the self. And I'm just going to read it from here. Now, so I'm quoting from The Ethics of the Concern for Self as a Practice of Freedom. So Foucault says, basically, insofar as the care of the self enables one to occupy his rightful position in the city, the community, or interpersonal relationships, whether as a magistrate or a friend, the care of the self implies a relationship with other insofar as proper care of the self requires listening to the lessons of a master. So I see self as a relational construct. Basically, it's in relation to, obviously, to ourselves, but also to the city and to the others, because this notion emerged from this self-organized context. It was not my invention, because the community is self-economized and self-securitized, in my opinion, because they did have their security apparatuses, such as like having WhatsApp groups, and then having shifts to guard the neighborhood from the police invasion and from the outsiders. So every day, 5 o'clock, 3-4 people would go up to the rooftops, or maybe even during the night, and watch and basically surveil the neighborhood. So I see the self in relation to the others, but also in relation to the ethics of taking care of ourselves. For the ancient Greeks, if we do not take care of ourselves, we're not able to take care of other people. And because, they do mention this master-slave relationship, but for the Greeks, it was not ideal to be a slave. So everybody obviously wants to be a master. And in order to be a good master, you have to be able to look after yourself very well. But it's not like these self-help books or whatever we're talking about. Taking care of yourself is like knowing yourself, and that it's more about the knowledge you have about yourself, your limits and your potential, your contributions. So every free Greek citizen had the right to basically participate in how the city was run. So for me, my self-organized interlocutors were also in conversation with the city life. They were doing all of this right in the center of the city when the state was trying to marginalize and push people to the camps, which are in unknown places. So if anyone dies, nobody even knows. So by bringing refugees to the center and through this self-organization, this was also basically claiming space in the city and with the others. So another thing I learned in this field work was not like these antagonistic relationships. Even they were, of course, critical of the state. It was like never this discourse of against the state, but like more parallel and more like coexistence. So this was coming from, and for me, not a neoliberal understanding of the self and the organizing the self, but it's also a more citizenship practice, I would say, like claiming that you have this space in the city. So I see the self as relational, but also as a collective notion. So when we say self-organization, we're not talking about one person. We're talking about bodies of lots of people coming together and making one collective. So yes, it is the individual, but it's also the group. That's what we meant.
Very good. I'm just making up a question right now from what you said. As you mentioned, like social linguistics looks at interactional practices, and usually to these micro events where society is created and recreated. Yet, in this, say, movement to study like how capitalism and in particular neoliberalism influences, workers and people in general, like precarious workers, etc. There is this perhaps this tendency of looking at this like situation of precarity pretty much along the lines of what some anthropologists would call the suffering slot. So you look at these people in these like precarious situations, and perhaps with this, view that may not coincide with what these precarious workers are doing, etc. Anyway, so what I want to ask you is how you mentioned the idea of like collectives and how this work is like this, for example, this self-securitized context you analyze, but also self-governed. You mentioned the idea of like a counter state as this kind of reminds me of Foucault's, heterotopia, this utopia that is actually existing and not this only imaginary space. So if you could just elaborate on how you see on the ground the work of these, activists, these agents in these collectives, creating, alternatives to capitalism, or how they, get to survive, these inequities, and maybe not surrendering to this, suffering slot. They're doing things, and how can we learn from what they're doing?
Yeah. This is a great question. So it was very interesting for me to find out that a lot of these initiatives were very inspired by the Kurdish movement and the notion of democratic confederalism. So it's so interesting to also, for me to talk to you a little bit maybe about the circulation of knowledge in these self-organized spaces. Basically, there's like a lot of knowledge exchange. We would think that only academics are doing this. So these guys do have like certain readings. They have, very rigorous, I would say, educational and pedagogical apparatuses that prepares them to self-organize, because they are super aware that this is not just a group of people coming together and accomplishing a very romantic idea. I think that was the idea for some revolutionaries earlier, but for these guys, if you want to do something in the center of the city, you have to really mobilize knowledge and different people and other resources together. So one interesting thing for me was how they self-economized. Basically, they had a bakery where they were making bread and then selling this bread for 1 or 2 euros. And with this money, they could have internet, and through internet, they could, for example, write their texts and also publish these texts on their websites, and also be in solidarity with other people in other countries, like in Europe and even in US, I would say, because there was this whole circulation of this knowledge and practices that worked and that didn't actually work. So yes, so the idea of being self-organized is not actually super easy. So yeah, we start with self-economy, but then how do you actually bring people together and construct something shared? Food was interestingly one tool for this. So they had also a collective kitchen, and there are lots of collective kitchen initiatives in Athens. So the whole idea is basically capitalism makes you isolated and you sit alone and eat your own food, and you don't need to interact with anyone. So food is like one way of bringing people together. It helps people to build trust and relationships. So this kitchen activity I thought was so banal, but at the same time it made so much sense, because you're basically making food and eating together. And so these kinds of activities basically push the governmental interventions away. So because you don't need anything from the state this way. You've occupied some buildings, you don't have to pay rent. You collect food from the street markets, and this is something that I was very interested in. So we would go and collect the leftover vegetables and fruits. And then they come and cook it, and then the whole consumption. And then you will see that actually it's so simple to be a human, to have a decent life. Like, why would I really need the state. So it really made me question. I think David Graeber also, he went to Kurdistan actually, and he was interested in this question too before me. So no, I'm not the first person, but it does really make you think, like, why, at what point we really needed the state as humans, and is it really so for these guys, I think it was a little bit experimenting that idea and playing with that idea, and not like really having a super clear idea about perhaps like, well, are we against the state or whatever, but like, is it really possible to live a life, a decent life, without all of this oppression and hierarchies and everything else coming from outside? So I asked that question to myself, and actually it really freed me from many things, because we really structure our lives like you have a career and then you get a mortgage, you get a promotion, you go from A to B to Z. And then you find out like, you can actually read lots of books and live for free, and why not? I'm not trying to romanticize. I think there's a lot of suffering to that life too. I can't say, yeah, I admire that kind of life. That life comes with a lot of struggles. But even the idea of experimenting it, allowing ourselves, like, could this be possible? Could humans actually live this way? Not maybe everyone, but yeah, I would say it was more of an experimentation than something that could be, absolutely implemented. And I don't know, this space was also very, very dynamic. So a lot of ideas might change in the future as well. But the whole idea was like, can people from different abilities and different backgrounds coexist and live together and still be okay? Like, because there were extremely disadvantaged people, like people who used to be on drugs, and they would be on treatment, and then there would be these extremely politicized people, but also at the same time lots of intellectuals were interested in these spaces. So what could be actually co-created, and could this be a model? I think the what was being tested was, could we actually have a new model, because capitalism is somehow not satisfying our needs. I mean, it satisfies our needs as long as we are healthy and we can sustain ourselves. But when we collapse, so for these guys, they either lost their jobs, they lost their health, they lost their home, and then this is what happens. So it's only good as long as we sustain ourselves, but the moment we collapse, what is it there? Because the Greek state, I mean, in a way has failed with the 2008 financial crisis. So people had to rely on intimate relations, like their families and friends. So there is no state structure like the UK, where you can just go to the job center and get your, I don't know, rent paid. So it actually brought this like idea of how humans could relate to each other in a way that would sustain themselves and the others. So this is actually the whole thing about, yeah, taking care of the self and the others.
Okay, Birgul, we were thinking of yet another question, because I think we still have some time, and this is being, really great, because I'm very interested in the, in the racial dynamics that both in your, your home context and your research as well. And, usually securitization is conceived as, the action, the act or the action of moving a group or an issue out of the democratic rule into a territory of the extraordinary, right, of extraordinary measures or a state of exception. And I'm wondering, do you think that that presupposes a state of democratic normality, right? You know, you need a normality of democracy so beforehand, so that you get out of it into a more securitized environment. Do you think that view is Western or Euro maybe centered? Do you think that the concept applies to non-Western contexts, where racialization, police, violence may have different meanings? So do you think we can use securitization maybe a little tweaked with some observations, but do you think we can use this concept in other contexts where democracy itself is even more far-fetched than in these countries? I hope I've made myself understood.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm basically interpreting your question like securitization in relation to race and perhaps migration as well in my context, I would say. Yeah, so securitization was basically invented also in a European context. And I think even if it's not in some scholarship, explicitly explained as it has something to do with migrants, because I think Constadina and Ben, they do, and I think Danielle, you are also in that paper, when they're talking about 9/11 and, how this whole thing became. And obviously with 9/11, we're also talking about, in a way, brown people or Muslims or, any sorts of people who are categorized as others. So I think we cannot really dismiss securitization. I mean, dismiss the dismiss race from any kind of securitization theory or argument. So so I'm just like, my mind is going back to Tommaso and Erez's paper, like how securitization is not about feeling safe, but it's all about these practices that it's a process of being made unsafe, right? So because Danielle is here, I'm like, maybe it's if I am really explaining it well or not. But yeah, so when we look at these processes, it definitely has an element of race and also being made feel unsafe. This is another thing, because like recently I am very interested in this notion of whiteness, because I never felt so brown. I think I'm in an extremely white space right now, which has made me to think it's this idea of making other people unsafe. And how does that happen? It's like, obviously accent and to an extent your physical characteristics, your linguistic characteristics, all of these somehow make you the suspect, somebody who's not to be trusted. But this is not like an existential or psychological trust. This is something like, the others want to keep a physical distance from you, because in a way your body is also seen as a threat. So until coming to Exeter, I have never actually experienced like people physically stepping back from me, which has been something really interesting. And then I noticed like in especially very, very white spaces is feeling secure, or even the process of, feeling safe has something to do definitely with race. And in the migratory context, obviously the border crossers migrants are immediately a security threat. I mean, you go on the news, or any newspaper would just explicitly talk about, that this is a security issue, and that we are being threatened by these people. Although they may not have weapons, just their bodies and their whole existence makes them a security issue immediately. Yes, but this whole thing about, all these practices and processes, and how also language gets entangled with this, is still something, I'm not, let's say, 100% clear about. But I don't think any securitization conversation can dismiss the idea of race from this, because I don't see the same thing happening among white people. This threat thing doesn't happen, and you can see that this is not a psychological unsafety. This is more of a different type of feeling safe. Danielle, do you have something to say about it?
Yes, indeed. I was a question that was coming to my mind while you spoke, and we're here talking about, sociolinguistics and securitization. You started by talking about your language, and I mean the identity of the community you were born as a security issue, and that is entangled with a racial issue. Like there's you were born in a nation state where some racial groups are framed as enemies, especially after the coup, etc. And you are studying. You have been studying the migration process and collectives that navigate the results of this refuge that people take elsewhere, which starts from inequalities and global inequalities, war, etc., and capitalism. And it's very interesting to understand that this racialized order is also the insecuritized order, right? Because these communities tend to be framed as security threats, like kurds, as you mentioned, and of course the dynamics in the refugees in Europe are very complex, but this idea of this threat is also a problem, and like a national and local problem, and we see that getting entangled with extreme right wing politics in Europe and the United States, etc. So for me, like it's very interesting to engage with people who are experiencing this, and I'm talking here about the favela, where people are racialized. Most of them are Black people, but also whites in favelas are racialized as others and are framed as these like criminals, and we need to securitize them. And here in Brazil, perhaps we have the scale of inequality is gets just staggering. Just 2 days ago, another police raid in the Complexo do Alemão favelas where I studied was carried out, and some 8 people were killed, and the excuse that the police gives is that they're looking after drug dealers, etc. But we know that that's not the case. That's this like idea of like harsh policing and securitization as this way of handling these enemy other, right? Maybe a conclusion among many that I could draw from this conversation is that it's extremely important to to understand what people who are framed in these conditions, both we as scholars, and it's very, very important to hear your story, Birgul, and I think that really will resonate with the life stories of many who will listen to this podcast, and because this many things that happen in the Middle East resonate with things that go on here because of these global inequalities, etc. Like the Complexo do Alemão favela was narrated for many years in the news here as the Gaza Strip of Rio, And anyway, so maybe one of the conclusions is this. So what can we learn, right, from people on the ground and from these conversations? And it's very interesting. Like once I asked because I've been always interested in this idea of like self, governance, self, empowerment, and the state. And I happened to ask to this Complexo do Alemão activist, how does he, as an activist, as someone who's navigating this and also kind of like trying to reach to the state, how does his struggle relate to the state? And then he replied, what is the state? I don't see any state. So yeah, for me that was very challenging, and it's I think that we should inquire more and more these resonances, across these global spaces, because I think we're talking about, a big problem, and about how people on the ground respond to this problem.
Yeah, that's a great point. My last words would be, I think it's not easy to be away from the state apparatus that much. And the state, unfortunately, has made up their mind that they are going to criminalize these people one by one, because one of the requirements of really governing people is to spot every single individual person and understand their potential. So this is why even very petite crimes that racialized people, commit get a lot more serious reactions, like they would be, for example, imprisoned for very, very small things, while a white person could just get away. And in one of the papers that, Ben and one of, I think, his PhD students wrote, like this study, I think, was in Germany, where, like when white activists could easily get away with certain things, migrants could not. And recently I have come across with this idea of like why, for example, people of color or brown people cannot even give feedback, because we're just supposed to take advice and get feedback, but not give. So this, being docile is just expected of us. But at the same time, the smallest, slip of the tongue or the smallest question, whatever, immediately turns us into a suspect. So recently, for example, I've noticed whenever I have disagreements, this is interpreted as miscommunication. But whenever other, more white people have miscommunicated something. This is a threat. This is a serious problem. So I could see that even with the smallest thing, like how the system is so ready to criminalize, racialize people. And I think my interlocutors and probably your people are trying to keep away from the structures as much as possible, who are just out there to catch them, So this is why, I think self-economization and, eating together and doing these little things and keeping as much as possible away from the system helps them, because there's a system out there that is so ready to just, catch these guys and just criminalize them. And I think their whole existence is already decided that it's a security issue, no matter what. And there is no, I think, other way but to, self-organize.
Okay, so this was wow. This is great. I still, I'm happy you say you still have questions, because it makes us our research necessary. So not only a pleasure. And I'm thinking, you said it yourself. It's like some people are going to be harassed, are going to be persecuted, no matter what. So I keep coming back to this issue of democracy and how it's taken for granted in places like the UK, and I believe the US. At the same time, there's some level of normality that societies reach, to make everyday life possible. And I like the notion of securitization, because I think it puts the issue of security at the center of everything, and it's sort of creates the basis for policies, and we get to see in sociolinguistics, the whole, as Ben always repeats this, and I think it's great, that the whole interaction order that's only loosely coupled. Of course, it's not his conception; it's Goffman's, but the interaction order, which is only loosely coupled with the social order. So I think we're in a very, very good position to look at. So, okay, there is this, state regulation thing, but who's to say people are going to do that, on the ground, and what's going to happen on the ground? It's always sort of a mystery, and I think we're well positioned to, to capture that, looking at SWATs, looking at favelas, looking at small streets, or and how people interact and deal with, and I do think it's a trend in terms of security that we're seeing. And to think Turkey, the whole thing about authoritarianism and figures like Erdogan, pop up, and after our experience with an authoritarian, such names have become somewhat popular here as well. So that was it for me. I'm not sure if you have any other comments. Please feel free to add. For me, it was such a pleasure to talk to you again. I know I've been able to be around you a couple of times, and it's always very good to see your face and talk to such a brilliant person with such incredible things to say that I had no idea. It's always very fun to learn with you, Birgul. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you, Douglas, and thank you, Danielle. It was a great pleasure to be with you. And yeah, we'll hope to see you again.
Yes, let's maybe here. Why not?
Yeah,
You
I
know,
hope so. I would love to see Brazil.
yeah. And oh, by the way, you can say goodbye to our audience and send them some beijos. Why not? Daniel, would you like to say anything else? And thank you very much, Daniel, as well, for everything. As usual, you're just great guy. I'm very lucky to have you.
Yeah, I just want to say obrigado and beijos to Birgul and to the audience. I'm sure people will really enjoy this. Thank you.
I did. Thank you.
Thank you.
Então, pessoal, esse foi o nosso episódio do nosso podcast. Não se esqueça de acompanhar as nossas redes sociais, é @contextostufrj no Instagram e no Twitter. Acesse também o nosso site caso fique interessado em ler ou produzir textos para este projeto. Aceitamos em vários formatos. Vale a pena conferir. O endereço é contextist.letras.ufrj.br. Até o próximo!